The screaming ended after 3 days. Not because the victim had died, that would have been merciful. The human body, however, has a breaking point where the voice gives out. The vocal cords tear, the throat becomes raw, and even the worst pain can only bring a wet, rasping wheeze. The torturers in the Tower of London knew this very well. They kept careful records. The moment of the first scream, the moment of confession, the time when the voice failed, and the moment when the eyes grew empty though the heart was still beating. You have seen torture devices in movies, the Iron Maiden with spikes, the rack stretching bodies until the joints snapped. But those Hollywood images do not show what really happened in the stone chambers under European castles. The true instruments were far more precise, more deliberate. The men who built them understood anatomy like surgeons. They knew exactly how much pressure a femur could endure before breaking, and exactly where to put a blade so that a victim would remain alive and conscious for days while the body was slowly destroyed. Let me show you 11 devices that defined human pain, beginning with one so cruel that prisoners sometimes bit through their own tongues to avoid it. The rack. The rack looked simple, just a wooden frame with rollers, ankles tied to one end, wrists to the other, and with each turn of the crank the body stretched. But the Duke of Exeter knew exactly what he was doing when he brought the rack to the Tower of London in 1420. The assistant executioner would put his hand on the prisoner's chest, feeling for the moment when the breathing changed, when the body realized what was coming. Then the crank was turned. The ropes tightened with a sound like the rigging of a ship in storm. The shoulders burned as they pulled against their sockets. But this was only the beginning. With the second turn and the third, the real torment began. The spine stretched, vertebrae separating with wet cracks that echoed in the stone walls. Witnesses said it sounded like breaking green wood, but it was the cartilage between the ribs tearing apart. The hips dislocated with a grinding sensation that victims said felt like their bones were full of broken glass. An askew was put on the rack in 1546. The Protestant martyr was an educated woman, already interrogated. And when they stretched her on the rack, something happened that had never been seen in the tower before. The regular torturer refused to go on. He said that Anne's joints were already separated, and that to continue would kill her. So the Lord Chancellor himself took control, turning the rack until her shoulders and hips were completely dislocated, until her elbows bent backward unnaturally. She had to be carried to her execution in a chair, because her body could no longer support itself. She never gave them a single name. But this is what the movies never show, what happened afterward to those who survived. Once the ligaments had been stretched beyond their limit, they never healed again. Victims lived the rest of their lives with joints that could slip out of place from something as simple as reaching for a cup. Their spines remained stretched, making them taller but unable to stand straight. The damage to the nerves was permanent. Some suffered sudden painful spasms even years later, when their muscles twisted in vain to protect joints that would never recover. And yet, compared to what came after, the rack was almost merciful because at least it ended quickly. The Spanish donkey. The Spanish donkey could continue for days. Picture a wooden beam in the shape of a triangle, its top edge sharpened like a wedge, raised on legs like a sawhorse. Now imagine being forced to sit astride it, naked, with your entire body weight pressing down on your groin. The victim was lifted onto the wedge, with legs hanging on each side. Within minutes, the sharpened edge began cutting into the soft flesh of the perineum. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, described as if a sword was being slowly pushed upward through the body. But the torturers were not satisfied with gravity alone. They tied weights to the victim's ankles, 20 pounds at first, then 40, then 60. Each new weight forced the wedge deeper. The design of the device, if such cruelty can even be called design, was that it attacked the most sensitive nerve-filled part of the body, while the victim stayed conscious. Men felt their scrotum tear open like overripe fruit. Women experienced their pelvic bones being pulled apart by the pressure. In the end, the weight could drive the wedge so deep that it reached the tailbone, sometimes splitting it completely in two. One record from the British Navy states that after only 2 hours, a man's ability to have children was permanently destroyed. After 4 hours, victims lost control of their bladder and bowels for life, the nerves responsible for those functions severed by the wooden edge. After 6 hours, the pelvis itself began to fracture. The Spanish Inquisition was especially fond of using this instrument on women accused of adultery or witchcraft. They sometimes coated the wooden wedge with salt or vinegar, adding a chemical burn to the splitting pain. One inquisitor's notes describe leaving a woman on the device for 3 days. By the end, the wedge had cut so deep that her hip bones could be seen on either side of the beam. Those who survived, and many did not, dying from blood loss or infection, were left permanently deformed. They walked with a strange waddle, because their pelvis never healed correctly. Many could never sit normally again for the rest of their lives. The psychological damage was just as severe. Survivors spoke of nightmares even decades later, in which they felt their bodies being torn apart again. But if the Spanish donkey destroyed from below, the next device struck at the very core of human identity, the skull itself, the head crusher. The head crusher was cruelly simple, with a metal cap for the head, a bar under the chin, and a screw that forced them together. The prisoner was seated, with the chin resting on the lower bar. The metal cap was set on top of the head, often with deliberate slowness, so the victim fully understood what was coming. Then the torturer would begin to turn the screw, just a quarter turn at first. Pressure built inside the skull like the worst headache imaginable. With another quarter turn, the molars began to throb as the jaw compressed. This was where the true horror began. As the screw tightened, the weakest bones of the skull gave way first. Teeth burst under the pressure, flying from the victim's mouth like bullets. The jawbone shattered, sharp fragments pushing through the flesh of the cheeks. But the screw kept turning. The human skull can take about 520 pounds of pressure before cracking. The head crusher could apply more than 1,500 pounds. As the force increased, the skull began to warp. The temporal bones above the ears cracked first, then the occipital bone at the back of the head. Witnesses compared the sound to walnuts being crushed. And then came the eyes. The growing pressure inside the skull had no escape. The eyeballs bulged outward, straining hard against their sockets. With one more turn of the screw, the eyes would burst out completely, hanging by the optic nerves. Some designs of the head crusher even had small cups to catch them. At this stage the victim remained conscious, blind but aware, feeling their skull collapsing like an egg squeezed in a vice. Records of the Spanish Inquisition describe the head crusher used on a Protestant minister in 1563. They tightened the screw just enough to shatter his teeth and break his jaw, then stopped. He was kept in the machine for 6 hours, the torturers occasionally striking the metal cap with a hammer to send waves of pain through his breaking skull. When they finally freed him, his face was so disfigured that even his wife could not recognize him. He confessed to everything demanded. Those who survived the head crusher, often used just short of lethal, lived with terrible injuries. Jaws shattered and never healing, blindness from destroyed optic nerves, deformed skulls that caused constant headaches and pressure. Many endured seizures for the rest of their lives, their damaged brains never fully recovering. And yet, even the head crusher seemed less cruel than the deliberate sadism of the next instrument, the Judas cradle. Picture an iron pyramid, 3 feet high, its point sharpened to a tip no wider than a fingertip. Now imagine being suspended above it, naked, legs spread apart and slowly lowered onto that point. The Judas cradle turned gravity itself into a weapon of destruction. The victim was hoisted by ropes, their legs bound and pulled wide. The pyramid's tip was placed directly under the anus or vagina. Then, with terrible slowness, they were lowered down. The tip first touched, then pressed, then entered. The victim's body weight drove the point deeper, ripping and stretching the most sensitive tissues. But the torturers had made this process into an art. They did not simply drop the prisoner, that would have ended too quickly. Instead, they lowered them inch by inch. The point was inserted just enough to bring unbearable pain without causing instant death. The victim would be held there, sometimes for hours, while their legs cramped and failed as they struggled to hold themselves up. Some Judas cradles were heated over fire. The pyramid was set above glowing coals until it turned dull red. The victim felt the heat rising as they were lifted into place, knowing what would follow. When lowered, the burning iron cauterized as it tore through flesh, stopping blood loss that might have granted unconsciousness. The Spanish Inquisition used the Judas cradle widely in the 16th century. One account tells of a woman accused of witchcraft who was placed on the device for 12 hours. The torturers lifted and dropped her repeatedly, each fall driving the pyramid further in. By the end, the iron tip had pierced through her rectum into the abdominal cavity. She lingered 3 more days before dying of septic shock. The destruction caused by the Judas cradle was total. The pyramid ruined the anal sphincter, leaving survivors permanently incontinent. In women, the Judas cradle could tear through the wall between the rectum and vagina, creating fistulas that never healed. The stretching and ripping of the inner tissues brought massive infections. Many victims died days or even weeks later from peritonitis, as bacteria from the torn intestines spread into the abdominal cavity. But perhaps the most psychologically destructive part of the Judas cradle was its sexual element. It was not simply torture. It was rape carried out by an object, a violation so deep that many victims could never speak of what had happened. The shame and trauma remained long after the body had recovered, if it ever did. The breast ripper. This device pushed sexual cruelty even further, a tool made for the mutilation of women. Constructed from iron, it had 4 claws that could be heated until glowing red. These claws were clamped onto a woman's breast, the sharp points piercing the flesh. Then, with slow, deliberate force, the torturer would pull. The claws ripped through skin, fat, and mammary tissue, tearing the breast from the body. It was not done quickly. The executioner pulled with care, sometimes taking several minutes to tear it away completely. The victim felt every fiber of flesh splitting, every vessel bursting. If the claws were heated, the smell of scorched flesh filled the chamber as the metal burned through tissue. Some women fainted from the agony. They would be revived with water, and the process repeated on the second breast. The breast ripper was usually used on women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or other so-called crimes against morality. It was both torture and symbolic punishment, striking at the very essence of womanhood and motherhood. The version fixed to a wall, known as the iron spider, was even worse. The woman was pressed with her breasts against the metal spikes, then pulled away, leaving her breasts still stuck on the claws. One recorded case from 15th century Germany tells of a woman accused of adultery who faced the breast ripper. The iron claws were heated until they glowed white. When they pierced her breast, witnesses said the sound of sizzling could be heard across the torture chamber. The torturer pulled so slowly that nearly 10 minutes passed before the breast was torn away. She lived, but 3 days later died from infection, her chest cavity open to the bone. Those rare few who survived the breast ripper were left permanently scarred. Beyond the obvious disfigurement, many endured constant infections because the wounds never healed well. The psychological scars were equally severe. These women were branded forever, their mutilation a permanent reminder of their supposed crimes. Many were cast out by society, unable to marry or remarry, forced to live as exiles. The pair of anguish. The pair of anguish brought torture directly inside the human body. Shaped like a pear and made of iron, this device was built from 4 metal segments that spread apart with a screw. In its closed form, it was smooth enough to be pushed into a body cavity. Once inside, the torturer would twist the screw, making the metal arms open outward like the petals of a lethal flower. The pear had different uses depending on the alleged offense. For blasphemers and heretics, it was forced into the mouth. As it widened, it dislocated the jaw, split the corners of the lips, and could break teeth or bones. For women accused of adultery or witchcraft, it was inserted into the vagina. For men charged with sodomy, into the anus. In every version, the expansion shredded delicate internal tissue, producing unbearable pain and lasting injury. The cruel design of the pear, if cruelty deserves the word design, was that the torturer could control it exactly. A quarter turn might bring discomfort. A half turn created intense pain. A full turn ripped tissue. Several turns could cause internal ruptures that never healed. The screw could be turned, left in place for hours, then turned again. One record from the Spanish Inquisition describes the pear of anguish used on a woman accused of serving the devil. The instrument was pushed in vaginally and then expanded slowly for 6 hours. Every turn of the screw delivered new agony as flesh stretched and tore. By the end, the internal wounds were so great that she bled constantly for days. She confessed to all charges, but died 1 week later from infection. The hidden nature of the injuries made the pair especially insidious. Unlike external wounds, which could be seen and perhaps treated, the internal tearing almost always led to infections that medieval medicine could not cure. Survivors were often left with fistulas, unnatural openings between organs, that caused incontinence or endless pain. The breaking wheel. The breaking wheel turned death into a public spectacle. The condemned was tied to the wheel, arms and legs threaded through its spokes. Then the executioner broke each bone with an iron club, starting from the legs and moving upward to the arms. Afterward, the wheel was raised upright and fixed to a pole, leaving the prisoner exposed to the weather. With bones shattered and twisted through the spokes at grotesque angles, the victim hung alive, sometimes for days. Crows pecked at their eyes. Insects crawled into the open wounds and laid their eggs. The crowd watched as the victim slowly died from shock, from dehydration, or from exposure. The number of strikes was usually specified by the judge. A so-called merciful execution might allow a blow to the chest or the neck, ending the victim's life quickly. But for the worst crimes, the executioner was told to avoid fatal blows, making sure the condemned would continue suffering on the wheel for as long as possible. In 1589, Peter Stump, known as the Werewolf of Bedburg, was executed on the breaking wheel. Accused of witchcraft, werewolfery, murder, and cannibalism, his punishment was especially brutal. First, red-hot pincers tore flesh from his body. Then his arms and legs were broken in 10 different places. Finally, he was beheaded and his corpse burned. Yet before that beheading, before that end, he spent long hours on the wheel, his destroyed body twisted into an impossible knot of pain. The breaking wheel's public nature had a purpose beyond the sentence itself. It was theater, a spectacle designed to frighten the population into obedience. The broken body on the wheel was left exposed for weeks, a rotting warning of the cost of defying the law. Birds built nests in the ribcage. Bones turned white under the sun. At last, only a skeleton remained, still woven into the spokes of the wheel. But even this long agony could not match the cruel efficiency of the next method. Saw torture, the saw. Such a simple tool, found in any carpenter's workshop. But suspend a man upside down, place a two-man saw at his groin, and it became one of the most terrifying forms of execution ever created. The condemned was hung by the ankles, keeping blood flowing to the head so that consciousness lasted far longer than it would otherwise. The saw was set at the groin, cutting through the genitals and into the pelvis. Because of the inverted position, the victim did not quickly lose consciousness from blood loss. The heart continued sending blood to the brain even as the lower body was being sawed apart. Some reports said victims stayed aware until the blade reached the navel. The process was meant to be slow. The executioners moved the saw steadily back and forth, each pass slicing deeper. At times they stopped to scrape away bone dust from the blade, prolonging the torment. The victim felt everything, the teeth tearing skin, grinding through the pelvic bones, rupturing organ after organ. A record from medieval Persia tells of a prince executed by this method. The sawmen were instructed to work slowly enough that he survived until the blade reached his chest. The ordeal lasted more than an hour. Witnesses said he screamed for the first 20 minutes, then made choking noises as his throat filled with blood. Yet his eyes stayed open and moving until the very end. The horror of saw torture was not only in the unbearable pain, but also in the total destruction of the body itself. Unlike other executions that left behind a corpse that could be buried, sawing left two halves of a human body. These halves were sometimes displayed separately, hung on different gates of the city as a warning to all. But perhaps no other torture device has captured both the imagination and the horror quite like the Iron Maiden. Even the name, Iron Maiden, sounds almost poetic, like something from a grim fairy tale. Yet the true reality was nothing less than a nightmare. It was a human-shaped coffin made of iron, its inner walls lined with sharp spikes set to pierce the body at dozens of points as the door closed. The spikes were carefully positioned to stab without immediately striking vital organs, ensuring a slow death through blood loss and organ failure. The most infamous Iron Maiden was kept in Nuremberg, Germany. This version had spikes designed to pierce the eyes, the throat, the heart, and the groin. The condemned would be forced inside, and the heavy door would be drawn shut slowly. As it closed, the spikes would drive into the body from all sides at once. The victim was trapped in complete darkness, impaled in dozens of places, bleeding slowly while their screams echoed from within the iron coffin. Some accounts describe Iron Maidens fitted with acoustic pipes that carried the screams outward, distorting them into inhuman sounds. Other sources claimed the spikes were placed to miss arteries, keeping the prisoner alive for many hours or even days inside. The door might be opened from time to check if the victim still lived, then slammed shut again to prolong the torment. The Iron Maiden combined claustrophobia, penetration, and slow death in a single device. To be pierced by dozens of spikes while locked in a coffin of metal embodied humanity's deepest fears. It stood as a symbol of the extremes of human cruelty, the point where invention itself was turned entirely toward producing suffering. Impalement. Unlike many legends, impalement was very real. Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered as Vlad the Impaler, made this execution his signature. The process was precise and deliberate. A long wooden stake, often 8 to 10 feet in length and as thick as a man's arm, was prepared. The end of the stake was not made razor-sharp, since that would bring death too quickly. Instead, it was rounded, and sometimes coated with grease. The victim was placed on the ground, the stake inserted through the anus or vagina, and then slowly forced up through the body. Here Vlad's infamous expertise appeared. His men knew exactly how to drive the stake so that it avoided instantly fatal injuries. They guided it carefully past vital organs, threading it through the torso like a grotesque surgical act. The stake would eventually emerge somewhere near the neck or the shoulder. Then it would be set upright in the ground, leaving the victim hanging above, their body slowly pulled down by gravity onto the sharp wood. Death could last for days, as the condemned slid lower on the stake millimeter by millimeter, their own weight forcing it deeper. They would die from a mix of causes: blood loss, septic shock, dehydration, and exposure. Birds often began eating from their flesh while they were still alive. In some cases, a wooden block was fixed to the stake to stop the body from sliding too quickly, deliberately prolonging the torment. In 1462, Vlad carried out what many chroniclers called his masterpiece of terror. When Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II advanced toward Vlad's capital of Targovist with his army, he was confronted by a ghastly forest of 20,000 Turkish captives impaled outside the city. Men, women, and children were placed in precise rows, their bodies at different stages of decay. The highest stake bore Hamza Pasha, the Ottoman commander. Vlad followed a system of hierarchical impalement, where the higher the rank, the taller the stake. The sight was so horrifying that even the hardened soldiers of the Ottoman army, men who had conquered Constantinople, refused to march into the city. Chroniclers wrote that some of the stakes still held living victims, their groans forming a chorus of suffering. The stench was unbearable, a combination of blood, excrement, and rotting flesh that spread for miles. Mehmed himself, a veteran of many wars, is said to have vomited at the sight and ordered his army to turn back. Vlad sometimes even dined while people were being impaled. One tale recounts that foreign envoys complained about the smell during such a meal. Vlad had them impaled on extra tall stakes, jesting that they would be above the stench there. It is claimed that during his reign Vlad had between 40,000 and 100,000 people impaled. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull represented another direction of cruelty. It turned torture into a performance. Invented by Perillos of Athens for Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in Sicily, the Brazen Bull was a hollow statue of bronze in the shape of a bull, large enough to hold a human inside. A door in the side allowed the victim to be placed within. Then a fire was kindled beneath the belly of the bull. As the bronze grew hotter, the person inside was slowly roasted alive. But the most twisted element of the device was its acoustic design. The bull's head contained tubes and pipes arranged to transform human screams into the sound of a bull's bellow. The louder the victim cried, the more the bull seemed to come alive, smoke streaming from its nostrils, the bellow echoing across the execution ground. According to legend, when Perillos revealed his invention to Phalaris, the tyrant asked him to demonstrate it. Perillos climbed inside to show how the pipes worked. Phalaris locked the door at once and lit the fire beneath, making the inventor the very first victim of his own creation. He was taken out before death and thrown off a cliff. But the warning had been delivered. Even the inventors of torture machines were sometimes not spared from them. The brazen bull killed through several combined effects. At first, the victim endured the burning heat, their skin swelling with blisters and charring. As the flames grew stronger, the body began to cook from the surface toward the inside. Soon the metal grew so hot that the fat inside the body melted, frying the victim in their own oils. Death came from a mixture of shock, suffocation, and the slow roasting of vital organs. What made the brazen bull uniquely cruel was the theatrical element. The torment of the condemned turned into a spectacle, their screams reshaped into the bellow of a bronze beast. People would gather to watch the bull appear alive, smoke rising from its nostrils, the sound growing louder as the agony deepened. These devices were not only tools of torture. They were also weapons of fear, built to shatter bodies and spirits alike, to spread terror so strong that whole communities submitted without resistance. They showed humanity at its lowest, when skill and imagination were devoted only to creating suffering. The men who worked with these machines treated torture like research, carefully recording what worked, what failed, and how long a human could survive each stage. They handed this knowledge to others, improving the methods, perfecting the devices. They turned cruelty into a profession. And the most haunting truth is that they worked exactly as intended. They forced confessions, worthless words spoken only to stop unbearable pain. They kept entire populations under control through terror. They produced spectacles burned into memory, stories carried forward for generations as warnings. The torture chambers of medieval Europe were not hidden in shame. They were formal parts of justice, their use written into law. Those who applied the screws or lit the fires were not seen as monsters. They were civil officials, paid wages, given pensions. The spectators were not seen as savages. They were ordinary men and women who sometimes brought children to witness what was called justice. The screams have ended, but the echoes remain.